Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. It's great to have you. Today's not really going to be a teaching per se. It's going to be just kind of like a little bit of a rant. Because I was doing a little bit of thinking about the wackadoodle wannabe. And isn't it kind of funny, right? How the wannabe comes up with these arguments, and usually what it entails them searching the scriptures diligently to find one passage that sounds a little different, or that might word something a little different, or might give them an impression that they are, Gentiles, or that they're part of the salvation narrative. One little passage, right? They gotta dig and dig and dig to find it. And what they do is they cling to that passage for dear life. They cling to it. Like Mufasa when he was hanging off the cliff, and Scar, that bastard, dug his nails into his paws, and poor Mufasa fell from the cliff and died, and little Simba saw his father plunge to his death, and then he became the Lion King, and he beat the shit out of him in the end. Sorry, I saw Lion King last week and I'm still a little bit fired up over it. But anyways, so they cling to these passages, right? And they say, oh, you got no answer for this one. But you notice how while they're doing that, right, they're also ignoring thousands of IO proofs in the process. So they might say, well, look at this over here. It says this over here, all the while ignoring that IO has built a Mount Everest-sized proof pile of scriptural proof for IO. Okay, and it's unbelievably massive, the amount of scriptural proofs for IO. Unbelievably massive. So these people, when they say, oh, you this passage disproves IO, or the way he words it over here disproves IO, or for instance, a lot of people like to use Ephesians 3:21, I think it is, where he says, and unto him glory, generation upon generation, world without end, or something along those lines, age without end. Well, they say, look, he's going to get glory forever. This means that we're part of the story. And they cling to that passage like Mufasa, all the while ignoring who the ones were, in the end, who were actually rejoicing and glorifying God around the throne. It was the 12 tribes of Israel, the 144K. They ignore that like the plague, right? So there's really no context with these people. They just kind of take every single passage in its own little vacuum. And they don't allow things to connect. They don't allow the big picture to, to mold their understanding of finer details. And they cling to these little stupid passages that, by the way, they have to really look for, right? One guy said it best. He said, I'm trying to remember how he worded it here. Let me see if I can pull up the quote. Okay, I believe I found them. Now, these are just really good statements that were made by a human that I used to communicate with before he went batshit crazy. And I like the way that he presents this dilemma, right? Because, again, it all kind of ties in with the fact that there is a mountain-sized pile of scriptural proof for Israel only. I mean, front cover, back to back cover, you name it. It's all in there, page to page. It's all about Israel. All right, and we see Jesus only came for them. The final scene is only them in heaven, and no one could learn that redemption song. So it's all in there, right? But yet these wannabes would have you believe that they have to search and find the one little place that might be worded a little differently, the one little loophole that supposedly God put in there to give people hope, right? All the while ignoring everything that, the Bible says about Israel. But here's what this human said. I'll leave his name anonymous. He said, quote, if there is a gospel remaining today, if the biblical message of salvation were intended for all of humanity in perpetuity, where are the explicit passages that tell us so? I don't mean the passages we have to wrestle with or force. I mean the explicit, plain, unmistakable, massive passages that God would mercifully make abundant, so there would be absolutely no mistaking his intent, and we wouldn't have to spend the entirety of our walking lives trying to prove it. Such an amazing quote there from a guy who was IO for a time and half of times, and then realized that, he had no arguments against it. I guess he kind of got cold feet and kind of ran back, and who knows what he's doing. He just fell off the face of the earth. This was a while ago. So God only knows what he's doing now. But it's just a very good statement. He says, if there is a gospel today, and the biblical plan of salvation was for all of humanity in perpetuity, then where are all the explicit passages? Not the passages that we have to force or wrestle with. I mean the plain, unmistakable, massive passages that God would make so abundantly clear so that there would be no mistaking his intent. Okay? Very, very great point by this man. Because there are none. There are none. Okay? What you have is a massive passages for the opposite, for the Israel-only perspective. Okay? I mean, how many times do we have to look in the Bible and read the word Israel, my beloved, my chosen, my people? I mean, it's all over the place. So that's actually what you have. You have a massive passages showing Israel only, and you have very, very few passages that might be worded a little differently, or a little tough wording, or whatever the case may be, or translated incorrectly, or whatever the case may be. But you have this small amount of passages that people cling to formulate an entire theory on the afterlife, all the while ignoring all these other ones. Now, here's another quote that this man said. He said, quote, "No matter how you slice the Bible up, one glaring and stubborn fact remains. In neither the Old or New Testaments can we find any type of global message. This was a local message for a local people located in one specific geographical area on the planet thousands of years ago." He goes on, he says, "Even if one were to somehow argue the Bible as a global message from God, this one fact remains. The message never traveled beyond the limited local in which it was initiated. If what God was doing through Moses or Jesus and the Israelites was the message of hope and salvation to all of humanity, how did those peoples living far, far away, even on other continents, before, during, and after the time periods in which Moses and Jesus lived, how did they get the memo? This was a geographic religion which was impossible to export to all people living on planet Earth at the time." Again, another very, very good and very intelligent, logical, well thought out quote by this man. All right. He makes great points. This was never a global mission. Jesus said the gospel would go to all nations and then the end would come. And it was going there by way of the Holy Spirit, and a few chosen individuals would take it there with that helper. There was no chance that these people would ever reach the people living in China, on the other side of the planet. And lest we forget, I mean, you have a total backstory of thousands of years of humanity before Jesus comes on the scene, and none of them would have gotten the gospel. None of them. Now, I've heard some pretty stupid explanations of, oh, well, the gospel is preached through the clouds and preached through trees, and we know God exists because of the trees, and that's the gospel. Like, I mean, how desperate and pathetic can a person be to resort to an argument like that? Okay, Jesus hadn't even come on the scene yet. The gospel wasn't even a thing yet. Okay? So how could anyone prior to Jesus believe in Jesus? It's just a dumb argument. It's desperation. Okay, so what? God just forgot about everybody prior to Jesus and said, oh, you know what? All the people who lived after Jesus, those are the lucky ones. They get salvation. They have the opportunity to receive salvation. Everybody before Jesus, they were shit out of luck. Talk about unfair. You think IO's unfair? At least with Israel, they were always his covenant people, right? With that other view that, you know, the people before Christ came were just shit out of luck. I mean, that just cuts people out on the basis of when they were born. So, just another great comment by this guy, great quote. The gospel and the message never reached any place beyond the limited scope and the regions around them where they were pulling the Israelites out from because they had been scattered and dispersed there. And then we have one final statement that this man made that I felt necessary to share. He says, quote, "No matter how you slice the Bible up, one glaring and stubborn fact remains." I'm sorry, I just read that one. Here's the other one. He says, "Believe me when I tell you, Jay, I have tried so hard for so long to make this book work as a message to the world in perpetuity, and I just can't do it. I want to do it. I desperately want to do it for the sake of meaning and purpose. I think I heard you say it once in one of your videos, and I also see that this book is miraculous. Its message, its coherence, its type and fulfillment, its prophecies, its brilliant depictions of the psychology of man, good and evil, etc. What are we to make of this? Here we have in our laps what seems to be a divine book that holds no message for us. No matter how hard I try, and I have tried to the point of physical pain in my head and emotional pain in my heart, I cannot find a way to jump into the plan. The text itself does not allow for me to play in that sandbox." Again, very honest, very logical, very clear, and I would fully agree. Okay, you have this book that seems miraculous. It's full of all this miraculous type of accounts. It does jive. You know, one of the things about Israel only that's so cool is like all these people argue that the Bible's inconsistent, that there's a lot of inconsistencies. You know, that's one of the main arguments with guys like, what's his name, Bart Ehrman. You know, he argues for the inconsistency of the Bible and how certain accounts contradict other accounts. But when you start to understand I.O. and you see things in an Israel-only lens, you realize that no, they don't actually. They actually are quite cohesive, right? There's actually a lot of unity and a lot of flowing context in the narrative when you understand it in I.O., in the perspective of I.O. That's one thing that The View has done for me. It's really shown the cohesiveness of the Bible as a whole, from cover to cover. So it's almost too perfect in terms of its cohesiveness about Israel, which, you know, usually means that it's probably just a tale. Who knows? But, yeah, so I just found these quotes interesting. I came across them as I was looking through some old stuff the other day, and I figured I would share them again because they are great quotes. From a guy that was once I.O., and then I think he just left religion and Christianity altogether. I think that was his next step. He just said, to hell with it. You know, it's not worth it. I can't figure anything out. The Bible's not our story, so I'm out. And I get it. You know, that's a escape route for a lot of people, and that's fine if that's what you want to do. I mean, I still enjoy studying the Bible. It's still a hobby and a passion of mine, just like anything, just like traveling, just like playing basketball. I like studying the Bible. It's one of the pleasures that I get in terms of piecing things together and seeing things that people have never seen before. So, yeah, anyways, that's all I wanted to say, folks. If you got somebody out there who's clinging to one or two, maybe three passages, and they say, look, it says this here, just bop them over the head, you know, and say, hey, listen, wannabe, you got a mountain-sized pile of evidence against your case. Why are you clinging to 1, 2, or 3 passages, right? Isn't it evidence? Isn't this an evidence-based argument? I mean, and it's not even close. It's not even remotely close. I.O. wins hands down every time. Anyways, folks, if you liked it, give it a quick like. I know it wasn't very scriptural today. Just wanted to rant a little bit. Hope you enjoyed it anyway. Give it a like, a Rooski, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back another day, another time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Hey, guys, one other thing I forgot to mention. I wanted to append this to the end of that. I had recorded that a few days ago, actually last week, I think. And just yesterday, a friend sent me some screenshots of the one and only Joe Dirt Simpson. Now, you remember a few weeks ago, a month ago maybe, I roasted Joe on the show and basically showed how delusional and desperate his attempts were to say that there's now a gospel mission part 2, like Mission Impossible part 2 or Men in Black part 2. It's now the gospel to the Gentiles part 2. And that's Joe's way back in. But somebody sent me this, and I just found it fitting to throw in here. And I even used it for the cover pick, one of his quotes, because it was just so pitiful. And this just gives you an idea into the mindset of a religious lunatic, really, who has nowhere to go. So now he's inventing new things to try to get back in. And so this is kind of like, I read those quotes earlier from that other guy who were, those quotes were logical and well thought out and, very good quotes. And now you're going to hear the other side of the spectrum, the complete other side, from someone who is a delusional nut job, okay? So I have two. You see the one on the cover pic, of course. We'll read that one second. But the first one is him. He posted this a few days ago, according to this screenshot. And it says, I plead with Don Preston, William Bell, Michael Miano, Holger Neubauer, Roy Runyon, Ed Stevens, and others. Join with us, repent, and help clean up the blasphemous and tragic mess we have helped to create. We owe the pitiful Israel-only people an apology. We made them stumble. Faith is being shipwrecked. So that was his first plea for help, and a bunch of people laughed at it and told him how dumb he is. But yeah, so that was number one. I found that funny. He's pleading with these guys to try to clean up the mess. And what he's implying by cleaning up the mess is either probably twofold. Either he's begging these guys to deal with Israel only because they're not. They're refusing to. Preston, Bell, none of them want anything to do with it, right? Nothing. Or he could just be saying, like, let's get together, let's put our thinking caps on, and let's come up with a satisfactory form of preterism that is better suited to include people today. And based upon the next quote that I'm going to read you, the one that's on the cover pic, I would have to say that that's probably the route that I would go if I had to guess what he's pleading for here. So the second quote, the one that's on the cover pic, hopefully you can read it. It says, looking for a label to put on the form of preterism I'm working on. Oh, God. To set it apart from both full and partial. The reason why I don't like partial preterism is that it doesn't acknowledge two equal resurrections. One at 80-70 and one at the end of world history. So he's right back into futurism again, right? He thinks that the resurrection of 80-70 is the first resurrection of Revelation 20, right? Where the martyrs, Revelation 20, first resurrection is only the martyrs, right? Those who had died. But what Joey Buttafuoco Buffoon isn't realizing is that the resurrection that was going to take place in that final generation of the New Testament last days was going to see the living saints change to immortal. Some of us won't die, but will be changed to immortal. We shall not all sleep, but will be changed to immortal. Those of us who are alive and remain until the coming will be changed to immortal. So Revelation 20 shows that the first resurrection was only the martyrs. It was only for those who had given their lives. But very clearly, the ones in the first century were told that some of them would not die and would be changed to immortal. Therefore, totally eliminating the notion that 80-70's resurrection was just that of the martyrs. Revelation 70 resurrection, Revelation 70. 80-70, last days, coming of the Lord, final resurrection was just that. It was the final resurrection. Paul said there was about to be a resurrection of the just and unjust. That's not just the martyrs, Joseph. So, pretty pathetic attempt here. And then he goes on, he says, so I'm thinking, proto-preterism. Preterism with futurism, he says. So that's his new idea. It's called proto-preterism. You guys can sign up at the table outside if you want, and he'll be reviewing applications to see if he'll allow you into that club, the Proto-Preterist Club. Then he goes on, he says, it would be like partial preterism, but it sees the events of the first century as full prototypes of the second judgment and resurrection. So the events of the first century, that being the final judgment, the final resurrection, the great white throne judgment, the final judgment according to works, the entrance into the kingdom, the inheritance of immortality by not only the dead but also the living, all of that was a prototype of the future final events. Right? So there'll be a second final judgment. There'll be a second final resurrection. There'll be a second final entrance into the kingdom. And there'll be a second final coming of Christ. Awesome, Joe. Then he goes on, he says, the first century wasn't merely a partial fulfillment. It was a real, substantial, full fulfillment. Hence, it was a real judgment and a real resurrection, albeit smaller in scope than the last one, of course. But it is also a prototype, but it is also only a prototype of the second, more expansive and universal judgment and resurrection. So you see, he's just making up his own shit. He's got a final end of the world, which he can't point to a single passage in all of Scripture that shows. He's got an end of all humanity. He's got a final judgment. He would have to have the world ending, right, to have a universal final judgment. So the world ends, everything's destroyed, and then there's a final judgment, which is total horseshit. The Bible says nothing of the sort. And then he goes on, he says, this is seen in Revelation 20. 2 crisis periods of fulfillment, each with a judgment and resurrection. That's an interesting one. He says, I now believe texts like Matthew 24 are examples of prophetic telescoping. Prophetic telescoping. Interesting. A technique common in Old Testament prophecy. Both ends are seen in Matthew 24, but Johannine eschatology, Revelation 20, separated them out. How dumb. How freaking dumb. Matthew 24 sees both ends, right? Even though Jesus said, all these things will be fulfilled in this generation. All these things. He didn't say all these things would be fulfilled in this generation and then all these things would be fulfilled again at the end of the world. This is a view that is making futurism look like it actually makes sense now, because this is totally bad. All right, his view here makes the people over at futurism look actually kind of smart, because compared to this nonsense, that nonsense looks more believable. Right? I mean, this is just terrible. Then he finishes it off. He says, this view will present a challenge, both to Israel only and the full preterism it is based on. It will also interact with partial preterism on the subject of the resurrection. So at the end, he shows his cards, right? He shows why he's trying to create a new view. It's just so he can defeat, or try to defeat, not defeat because he can't, but try to defeat or try to put forth a problem for Israel only by saying there's 2 fulfillments of everything. There's a double fulfillment. But again, what the bonehead is not realizing is that the fulfillment in the New Testament, last days, was the final fulfillment. Right? He's using he calls it prophetic telescoping, not realizing that the prophetic telescoping was the Old Testament telescoping to the final last days, to the New Testament last days. That's the type. The type is the Old Testament. The anti-type is the New. It ended. That's the fulfillment of it all. When you see the armies encompass Jerusalem, know that all things written will be fulfilled. This be the days of vengeance when all things written would be fulfilled. The days of vengeance when Christ would put all enemies under his feet. How long, O Lord, will you wait until you avenge our blood, said the one in Revelation, crying out. The blood cried out from the ground. Jesus said, when you see the armies encompass Jerusalem, know that these are the days of vengeance. He's getting vengeance upon them. Okay? And he's putting all of his enemies under his feet. So that coincides with 1 Corinthians 15, where death is defeated. Right? But according to Joe, Paul would also have to have 2 places where death is defeated, right? Death is defeated in AD 70, and then death is defeated again at the end of the world, which the Bible doesn't speak about. So this just gets more confusing and more hilarious as we go, folks. People are trying any and everything to get out from the headlock that is IO, albeit unsuccessful, of course. Excuse me. So I just figured I'd share that, because today was a day of quotes from men. And hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got a good chuckle out of it on this Monday morning. And I hope you all have a lovely, splendid day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.